Washington Journal continues.
It's the new administration, Christopher Hitchens. What do you think so far?
Good grief. Couldn't we have a honeymoon about that? I mean, not that I'm particularly honeymoon-minded, but I mean...
We can talk about Henry Kissinger.
Much better. I mean, well, about to say, it, as a salute to the re-entry of the Republican Party to Washington, especially its old military wing. Harper's magazine has, for your delectation, spread a great feast. And I was hoping we might just say a word about that before.
No, you can say anything you want. This is the cover of the magazine has
of
Henry
course,
Kissinger
we
on
did
it.
not, when they kindly agreed to run a long piece by me, actually the first of two, on this. We didn't know, of course, who was going to be taking over Washington this week.
What's the point of this piece?
The point of this piece is to try and do justice to Kissinger, and to try and do justice to his victims, and to try and point out to people who think that, didn't we do this once before, haven't we been into allegations about his past record, that in fact the law, nationally and internationally, has somewhat changed. The context in which great men and statesmen and potentates can treat people as disposable.
What's the charge here? What's your charge?
Charge is war crimes and crimes against humanity.
When did you get this idea?
Well, I've long had the impression that that could be said about him, at least morally or metaphorically. What I'm trying to argue here is that in the context that has evolved post-Pinochet, the stripping of immunity from the dictator in Chile, and the context that's evolved post-Milosevic, in other words, the decision by the international community to become seized of the idea of war crimes and crimes against humanity and to hold people responsible, bring them to justice.
What's the crime? Yeah, name you know, your charge.
In the case of, well, I have, in this opening stave, I have two. One, you might say, was micro, and one was macro. The macro one is Vietnam, is the deliberate extension of the war in Indochina, deliberate extension of it in two ways. First, the attempt by the Nixon team, which involved Mr. Kissinger, in 1968 to undermine the peace negotiations of President Johnson and Vice President Humphrey in Paris by going to the South Vietnamese side and urging them to boycott the negotiations on the promise of a better deal from the Republicans. This is a story you've probably heard in one version or another around the town over the years, but it's become a much harder and firmer story with successive evolutions. And I think I could claim that it's told here all in one piece, at any rate for the first time, though I've used the work of many other hands to do so. That's the first way the war was extended. The second was to extend it to Cambodia and to Laos by illegal, secret, mass, indiscriminate bombardment of civilians with the knowing and intended result of damaging the civilian population. Now, that was already illegal under the Nuremberg Code, but it's, so to speak, much more illegal now.
Why all these many years later, do you write about this?
Well, as I say, because since General Pinochet's immunity was stripped from him, first by the initiative of a Spanish magistrate, and then by the British House of Lords, and now increasingly, this week in fact, in the Chilean courts themselves, and since the setting up of the Rome Statute, as the International War Crimes Tribunal is now called, and the indictment of Slobodan Milosevic and his equipe, his aides, we're in a position to revisit some people who were thought invulnerable, who live right here in our own midst. And the Pinochet matter, I think, may be the crucial one, which is part two. Was it your idea,
or was it Harper's Magazine's idea that you do this?
We had a discussion about a year or so ago, and decided that it was time to have a crack at it.
Did Henry, excuse me, did Henry Kissinger talk to you?
He didn't.
Did you try to talk to him?
Sure did. I even offered him money.
What do you mean?
He's a very expensive guy. As you know, if you want to get Henry Kissinger to talk, you have to offer him a big speaker's fee. And when he didn't reply the first time, we said, well, look, name your price. We're not rich, but we'll try and...
How much were you prepared to pay him?
Well, I said we'd pay him what an average Nightline would pay him, because he's been on Nightline with Ted Koppel now upwards of several hundred times, and there are still some very important questions he's never been asked. I said, if you'll agree to answer the questions Ted Koppel doesn't ask you, we can probably run to a Nightline rate.
So Nightline pays him to go on there?
They used to. I'm sure they still do. He was an official news consultant. Mr. Copper once refused to tell me how much he was actually paid. Can I just let the other shoe drop on the micro thing in this piece?
Let me grab this call, and then we'll come back to it, okay? Mineola, New York, on the Democratic line for Christopher Hitchens.
Calls already.
Hi, Christopher, and I'd like to say it's great for C-SPAN to be reporting so many different aspects of everything. My question regarded that I'd never heard of anything in regards to missing Mr. Kissinger before in any of the media or on any front line, anything like that. And I was wondering why it's taken so long to come out on something like that then.
Well, I say in my introduction, actually, that one of the things about Mr. Kissinger is his very successful diplomacy with the press. He's not a very successful diplomat, in my judgment, on other fronts and in other matters. Greatly overrated reputation, in point of fact. But he has managed to get his column syndicated through the Los Angeles Times, and it appears in our hometown here in the Washington Post. He's been a consultant to ABC and I think NBC in his time. He's very frequently referred to on television. He's usually referred to as a referee rather than as a participant. In other words, he's the independent expert. It's not as if he's ever taken any side or any stand or has any interest of his own, though in fact his consulting firm continues to make and reap tremendous profit from some, in my opinion, very questionable things that he did while he was in office, and through the generosity of some extremely dubious clients, such as the dictatorship in China and the entourage of General Pinochet in Chile.
Chico, California, Republican line for Christopher Hitchens, excuse me. Go ahead.
Thank you, Ron.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a disgrace for C-SPAN to have this man on masquerading as a journalist.
That's more like it.
He's taken part in probably what is the most vicious and outrageous smear campaign I've ever heard several years ago against a patriot, William Casey, and at least Gary Sick had the good grace to disappear and not show his face anymore. The only question I would ask is, have you apologized to William Casey's family?
By no means, no. Mr. Casey doesn't deserve an apology from anybody. As you know, if he hadn't died when he did, he would almost certainly have been indicted for his part in the grotesque circumvention of the Constitution that was involved in the Iran-Contra matter, which, if you insist on bringing it up, which I'm happy you do, I remind you involved raising a private budget, which is strictly illegal, for conducting a secret foreign policy to circumvent Congress on two very important matters, Iran and Nicaragua, and involved raising that money from the shadiest middlemen in the drug and illegal weapons and hostage trading branches of international crime. So Mr. Casey was one of the supervisors of that, was probably lucky to die when he didn't, have no worse said about him in his own hearing.
Chico, do you want to respond?
In brief, no, I don't propose to apologize about any of that.
Yeah, Mr. Hitchens accused Casey of treason by getting the Ayatollah Khomeini to keep the American hostages held. It's totally disproven by a congressional committee.
Not disproven at all. Not disproven. That I would consider still to be an open question. I think Mr. Casey tried very hard to get that done. And I think it will one day be firmly established that he did.
Let's go to Peoria, Illinois next for Christopher Hitchens. Good morning.
I think the American people have been misled into believing that Richard Nixon ended the war in Vietnam. Actually, like was just recently reported in the newspapers, like 60,000 demonstrators at his inaugural back then. And there was a Christmas bombing just prior to the inaugural celebration and after his election. And actually, it was the Democrats in Congress who caucused and voted to end the funding for Vietnam that actually twisted his arm enough to make him go to the conference table and sign the peace treaty, that there was enough strength shown election district by congressional district for delegates to the Democratic National Convention for McGovern, that the Democratic congressmen knew that they were next on the line, that if they didn't vote to end funding for the war, their jobs would go, and the next primary season, they would be up against just opposition in many congressional districts and would be voted out of office. And that's the sort of power and arm twisting it took to get Nixon to sign that peace treaty.
I think that's largely true. I think one could add to it that the war had been, in effect, over in the minds of the political establishment. People like Robert McNamara and the others who'd originally designed it, William Colby. We have most of these people on the record. They were through with this war by 67 at the latest, 68 at the very latest. They knew that it was unwinnable. They knew they'd deceived Congress and the American people to get into it. They were looking for a way out. They had a way out in Paris in '68. And Mr. Johnson and Mr. Humphrey, who'd both been very hawkish, were willing to take it. At that point, the South Vietnamese pull out at the last, very, very last minute, the day before the election, ruining the talks, collapsing the re-election of the Democratic ticket. And the war is persisted with for another 4 years, maybe 5, and then ended by Nixon and Kissinger on exactly the same terms, in effect, as the Democrats had been offering in Paris originally. So that what you have to imagine, and this is the gravamen, if you like, of what I say in the piece, is that all the people who died in that intervening period had their lives deliberately thrown away. The calculation is, I don't have it exactly, it's in the piece, upwards of 25,000 young Americans, and we don't want to think about how many Vietnamese and Cambodians and Laotians, and then a scuttle on actually worse terms than could have been got in Paris. So it's, if my allegation is correct, and I'm willing to back it up in detail and at length, if it is, then the combined sabotage of the election and prolonging of that war would count as, I think, as the wickedest thing any American politician had ever done.
Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, Democrat for Christopher Hitchens. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Hitchens. I totally endorse your position on how the Vietnam War ended, and I'm sure you're correct on that. I looked into it in detail. But I was wondering if you feel the way I do, that people like Kissinger, their influence has stretched right into today's policy. For example, in Iraq, where the people are being starved and our water supplies are disenfranchised and poisoned and everything like that. Don't you feel that there's some criminal nature here over the matter of oil, that these people have to be starved? I mean, this is as bad as that of Hitler, in my opinion. Thank you very much.
Well, and I don't completely agree with you there, because I think there are two distinctions. One, Mr. Saddam Hussein could feed those people if he wanted to and chooses not to. And Mr. Saddam Hussein is everything that is said about him. I mean, I've been to Iraq several times. I've been since the war. I've been in Kurdistan. I've been to towns that have been bombed by him with chemical weapons. I've sat on an unexploded chemical bomb in the town of Halabja with Iraqi Air Force markings on it. I know that this stuff is not propaganda, and I've interviewed people who are still burning from what they were sprayed with. So no, I can't quite agree with you there. I wish I could, because I like your style about Mr. Kissinger.
Are you worried at all about libel or slander?
Not in the least, no. I mean, I think it would be excellent if Mr. Kissinger was to say, look, I had defamed him, and he wanted to see me in court, because one of the matters between us is that when he left office, unlike any previous Secretary of State, he managed by a rather, I think, shady deal to take a lot of his paper with him. He's contrived to own the archive of a lot of what happened in Chile, in Vietnam, in Cyprus, in other places, while he was not just Secretary of State, but National Security Advisor and Chairman of the 40 Committee, which oversaw all of American covert operations.
How much legal?
So if he wants to see me in court, he'll have to go through a discovery phase, which is exactly what
How much legal
I think
work
we
did
both
that?
need and deserve. I think it's extraordinary that he's able to own so much of the public record.
One quick one. How much legal work went into this with your lawyers?
Well, Harper's is very meticulously read by lawyers and by fact checkers for everything it does.
Hartford, Connecticut for Christopher Hitchens. Good morning.
Yes, good morning, Mr. Hitchens.
Morning.
Yes, it's a pleasure. I'm a great admirer, sir.
Thank you.
Before I ask my question, I hope that you'll consider writing another book about the Clintons, particularly Mrs. Clinton. I enjoyed your last one.
Well, the material seems to keep falling from the trees, but I'm steadily focused on Henry at the moment.
Okay, well, that's great too. I went through quite a period of my life considering Mr. Kissinger to be the world's most dangerous man, and
You went wrong.
I wonder if you, in your research, if you would be able to refresh my recollection on an incident involving a ship, a freighter, that was supposedly hijacked on the high seas and brought into Cambodia.
Yeah.
Is this familiar to you?
Sure. It wasn't a freighter. It was an American vessel called the Mayaguez. Certainly an American registered vessel, and it was held by the Cambodian authorities just with, that's a rather polite way of referring to the Khmer Rouge. I mean, they were the Cambodian government. They'd just taken power, in fact. In the early days of the Ford administration, and Kissinger decided, let's make this a test, let's show we can't be pushed around. And I describe it, in fact, in this same edition of Harper's.
Have you ever met him?
No, I haven't. I've been in the same room. I've heard him speak. I've attended lectures by him, but no, we haven't had the pleasure. I would find it, I must say, very difficult to be social to him.
How old is he?
Polite. How old is Kissinger? Old enough to know better. Over 80, I think. He's getting on.
Wakefield, Rhode Island, you're next.
What a joy it is to wake up and have Mr. Hitchens on the on C-SPAN this morning.
Hey.
His credibility is just beyond. It's just impeccable. I almost sent you the article, in fact, about Pinochet and Kissinger. This seems to be another in a long list of sort of bloodthirsty contacts for Mr. Kissinger. And I did want to second the gentleman who said, would you please consider updating the book No One Left to Lie To? And thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Can I just, would it be all right if I just said what part 2 of this
It would be.
Harper's thing was? Because I said there was one very macro thing. I said the whole scope of the Vietnam War and the extension of that into a war that engulfed the whole of Indochina and took the lives of innumerable civilians, and thus violated international law and the customary law of war. And the micro case I take is the case of the murder of a Chilean officer in 1970, shortly after the Allende forces had won the election in Chile. There was a general, General René Schneider was his name. He was the chief of the Chilean General Staff. And he upheld the view that the Chilean army should stay out of politics. He was a constitutionalist officer. He didn't have any political views of his own, or none that are known to me or anyone else. And it was cold-bloodedly decided in Washington, excuse me, I said cold-bloodedly decided in Washington that he should be taken out, that he should be iced, that he should be killed, murdered. And meetings were held at which Dr. Kissinger, as I keep trying not to call him, because I think it's too much of an achievement that he's managed to get everyone to call him doctor when he's only a PhD. Mr. Kissinger was present. At those meetings, guns were smuggled into Chile through the American diplomatic pouch and given to people who had already reputations for criminal violence in that country. And in effect, a hit was planned, a mob hit was done on a constitutionally minded general in a democratic country with which the United States had no quarrel, had excellent diplomatic relations, and was not at war. Now, there is no law that allows that to be done. There's no law that says, just because I hold a position in the United States government, I can plan a murder in someone else's country. And these and other atrocities that we've uncovered from the Pinochet period in Chile are beginning to catch up to Mr. Kissinger, and as I give evidence of knowing in this article, he understands this to be true. He knows the legal position is shifting against him, and that his claims of reasons of state won't shield things that, if done by other people, would lead to their imprisonment.
This article is in the February edition, 2001, of Harper's Magazine, the case against Henry Kissinger. Christopher Hitchens, your next call is from Knoxville, Tennessee. Hello.
Yes, good morning. Mr. Hitchens, I just wanted to say I've been a long-time admirer of yours. You've made me angry in the past and made me grateful, so I think you're a credit to your profession. I'm currently reading your article in Harper's. Thank you for your investigation and your writing of it, and I wanted to ask two questions, if I could.
Please.
First of all, have you had any, have you experienced any particular professional repercussions or pressure of any sort as a result of having written this, which I believe is the first of two parts?
Mm-hmm.
And also, if you do, I wonder if you could comment, if you have already, I apologize, but if you could comment on the odds of Kissinger ever actually being brought to answer for his crimes, and if so, where, what venue, and in what respect might that happen? Thank you very much.
Right. Well, no to the first, if you mean has anyone sort of threatened me or anything like that. No, that's not, I think, likely either. I've had a lot of people surface who I didn't know about before. That very often happens when you write on a topic like this. You meet the people you wish you had met in the first place, but of whose existence you were unaware. Some people in government, some people formerly in government, have already been in touch with me with more information. So when we next revisit this matter, we'll be undergirded with more testimony. And just you wait for part two, by the way. How vulnerable is he legally? Well, I think in the Chilean case, I'll just confine it to that for the moment, there are a number of people in Chile, relatives of people whose lives were ended by torture or disappearance or kidnap or extrajudicial execution, including the family, indeed, of General Schneider, who was murdered on Kissinger's orders, assassinated, I should say, on his order, who can bring suit in the United States under the Alien Tort Claims Act and may be considering doing so now that it has been established by the Hinchey report to Congress offered by the CIA on the connection between gangsterism in Chile and named known officials in Washington, D.C. Those claims would now have standing and would have to be heard. It'd be a civil suit. It would be pressing for damages, but it would be very damaging in other ways in its presentation of evidence. That's the single likeliest way, I think, that justice can be done. I think it's a shame that one should leave it to Chilean civilians and citizens and volunteers who've already been through enough to do this. I think he should be prosecuted in an American court under American law. But the view seems to be that we only think of war criminals as foreigners, and that it isn't possible that there could be one sheltering within our own borders. I'm hoping, of course, that this article helps to change that complacency.
C-SPAN 3 started today full-time, and if those of you who want more C-SPAN around the country, you can go to your cable operator and tell them that it's a digital channel. That's just a way of transmitting it on your cable system. It's free to our affiliates if they get C-SPAN 1, 2, and 3. And today is the first of the 24 hours. Also in today's USA Today, elections still splits court. Joan Biskupic reports, among other things, that Sandra Day O'Connor has told people close to her that in her 2 decades on the court, she has never seen such anger over a case. And it talks in here about some of the behind-the-scenes activities that the court's having a tough time getting back to normal. Westfield, New Jersey, for Christopher Hitchens. Hello.
Good morning.
Morning.
Mr. Hitchens, I admire you immensely. You're obviously dedicated to telling the truth, and I think that's really wonderful in this day and age. However, I have a question. I just wonder at the tendency of the media, and maybe including certain persons as yourself, with the, what's the word, you know, you have like a real desire to bring down heroes of the past. I noticed that when Clinton got caught, you know, all his friends were saying, well, the Kennedys did it, Roosevelt did it, you know, they all had mistresses and all that. And although I do admire, you know, the fact that you obviously are dedicated to finding out the truth, I'm just wondering what relevancy, you know, this has in today's divided nation. With your talents, why couldn't you, you know, for instance, devote yourself to exposing someone like Jesse Jackson, who has done so much to divide this nation, while at the same time, you know, being a hypocrite is shaking down corporations and taking money from them, because obviously these corporations are afraid of what Mr. Jackson can do. And
thanks, caller.
Well, it's hard to decline an invitation to take part in a healing process, but I think I will decline all the same. It's not somehow what I see myself doing, and actually I think I can cheer you up. Everyone else seems to want to volunteer to take part in the healing process. There seems to be no shortage of people who talk incessantly about unity over division. My view is that politics is division by definition, and so it's fatally foolish to talk about the politics of division as if it was a bad idea, since it's in the first place inevitable and in the second place, in my view, desirable that people would differ. You asked me why I pick on this particular public figure. I don't pick on him. He rather forces himself upon our attention. The United States goes abroad, in my opinion, quite often correctly. It goes to the United Nations, of which it's the host country and essentially the founding member. It goes to other international bodies and insists that certain people, Mr. Milosevic, for example, and others, wanted terrorists and gangsters, be brought to justice, that they be brought within the reach of law. Fine, but if that's to be done, and it isn't just going to be done as in the guise of the morality of a superpower or the self-righteousness of a superpower, then the United States must clean house and make sure that it isn't sheltering any wanted war criminals itself. And in this case, this very important instance, a man whose footprint can be found in Bangladesh in the massacres of the Bengalis in the early 1970s, in justifying the Tiananmen massacre in China, probably for money, in 1989, in destabilization and assassination in Cyprus and in Chile, and above all in the titanic extension and deepening into a real war of atrocity of the war in Indochina, this is not small stuff.
Front page of the LA Times, Powell intends to curb U.S. use of diplomatic sanctions. And this is a Robin Wright story this morning. We'll ask Mr. Hitchens what he thinks of this in a moment. First, New York City, you're on the air.
Good morning. I'm so glad that I got through. I just must say I love your style, Mr. Hitchens. I don't always agree with you. I'm so glad that you mentioned Cyprus. I was wondering if you could possibly just expound on that a little bit, just for the benefit of some viewers, because it's a subject that's been all but forgotten. I mean, it was such a travesty what occurred there, and Mr. Kissinger played a very pivotal role in that. And I just have one more comment. I would just like to say, as far as war crimes are concerned, yeah, everyone is after Mr. Milosevic, but we all very well know that there were terrible war crimes committed in the entire area. And the role that this administration, the previous administration, played in violating every international law as far as civilians were concerned. Thank you very much.
Okay. Wonder which end to start. I think we would disagree about Mr. Milosevic, as a matter of fact. I don't think that he was just one among many war criminals. It's true that the late Franjo Tudjman of Croatia was lucky to avoid indictment and might have been indicted if he'd lived. And there were other criminals too, but I think that the vast orchestration of crimes against humanity in what was Yugoslavia originates in the hysterical plan for a greater Serbia and for the reduction of the other republics to vassals of this ambition. Because I think that necessitated ethnic cleansing and all the things that, all the cruelty and violence that go with. However, we obviously both share a feeling about Cyprus, and I'll be brief if I may, because that's part of the second tranche of what Harper's is going to print and won't be out until the March issue. But briefly...
When's that coming out?
You could... it'll be out, where are we now?
January 22nd?
Yes, the Harper's is on the newsstands now, part one.
The February.
The February one, so in a month from now, you'll get
a whole month, or I mean, you're talking 3 weeks?
Well, probably. It depends somewhat. I wish I knew more precisely. I think we count ourselves on the newsstands on the 23rd of each month, but in big cities it's usually earlier, and for subscribers it'll be sooner. But just not to step on my story or on what the magazine has in store, but look, Cyprus can have a claim to being the other democracy in the Middle East, if you like. It's anchored just off Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, that coast. Democratic country, elected president, an archbishop, as a matter of fact, Greek Orthodox Archbishop Makarios, for many years, since its independence in 1960, targeted by Dr. Kissinger, who in his memoirs says, I've called him doctor again, it's a tick, I keep trying to repudiate this sort of subliminal propaganda of his. Mr. Kissinger says in his memoirs that the problem with Cyprus was that it had this democratically elected president who wouldn't always do what he was told. In particular, would not do what he was told by the military dictatorship in Greece, of which Henry Kissinger was then a great patron and defender and supporter. And briefly, I argue, I don't argue it briefly, but I'll summarize it briefly, that there was a plan simply to have the Archbishop removed, and the only way to do that was to cut him down with gunfire, which was tried, which failed, but in its failure provoked a terrible war, the terrible civil war among Greek Cypriots, and gave the opportunity for an invasion by Turkey of the northern half of the island, which turned into an occupation, an ethnic cleansing, and a colonization which persists to this day.
West Hyattsville, Maryland, on the Democratic line. You're on with Christopher Hitchens.
Hi, I wanted to say how much I admire your writing skill and your willingness to come forward to speak about these hard issues. But the question I had was, would you comment on how and why the Kissinger and his co-workers could perpetrate such a deception or fraud knowingly for so long about the war, the Vietnam War?
About the Vietnam War?
Yes.
Well, it took a long time for the documents to come out. It does in this culture in Washington. People have to develop a conscience and testify. Some documents remain under seal for a very long time. For example, Mr. Kissinger and I had a dispute recently, which I think I won, in the letters column of the New York Times book review. I'd been reviewing Anthony Summers' book, very excellent new study of the Nixon years. Mr. Summers, in his book, has only just now got the files that show that, and the transcripts, the photographic record of the transcripts of the FBI's bugging of the Nixon campaign, which was ordered by President Johnson in 1968, because they suspected that the Nixon team was making illegal contact with a foreign government to try and subvert the Paris negotiations. And the Logan Act, to give you a bit of a fill-in, makes that a very illegal thing for an American to do, as well as obviously a very wicked thing for a presidential candidate to be doing in the middle of a war and a negotiation and an election. Anyway, though the Johnson people don't like to admit it, they did bug the Nixon campaign, and they did find that that contact was going on. There was illegal and unauthorized contact, and Summers has the transcripts. Now, but that's... I've always thought that would be found out, but I only now can say I've looked at the proof of it in the last 3-4 months. So that's why it takes so long.
Are there other war criminals?
And you see, if you don't have evidence like that and you talk the way I'm talking, I can tell you what happens. You get accused of being a conspiracy theorist, of being a paranoid, and so on. And you have to be extremely meticulous. But we can now say that that attentat, that sort of internal coup d'etat in the United States, did take place.
Are there other war criminals, in your opinion, besides Henry Kissinger, in regard to the Vietnam War?
Well, you make me sound as if I'm the judge of all this, and in a sort of Solonic position.
But in your sense,
yes, I mean, the difference being this: people like Robert McNamara, William Colby, who wrote Honorable Men, the Bundy brothers, and so on, who were architects of that war and did know of terrible things and did conceal their knowledge of them from the public, have tried to make an atonement. I mean, I don't know whether Robert McNamara would call himself a war criminal, but he certainly feels he has a very bad conscience about what he did and also about what he said.
What about Lyndon Johnson?
And there's every evidence that Mr. Johnson went to his grave extremely oppressed by the thought of what he'd done and how many people had died as a result. The difference in the case of Henry Kissinger is this. No, he's the only one of the people who had any part in really keeping that war going, and extending it and deepening it and running it, you know, intimately and knowing very, very well indeed how many people were being slaughtered, who's never made the smallest act of contrition. He's never attempted the tiniest bit of accounting or accountability, and only shows any indignation, even any pulse of emotion of any sort, when his own reputation is impugned, as it now has been.
Lakeland, Florida, Republican for Christopher Hitchens.
Yes, you've been talking about the past. Oh, praise be for C-SPAN. But you've been talking about the past. Let's talk about the future a little bit. In the U.S. Senate, who is going to be the Republican spokesman for foreign policy? Is it going to be Jesse Helms or Richard Lugar? I want African Americans to come and rally for Richard Lugar, because Jesse Helms takes over and is the spokesman. It's going to be hell to play. And so African Americans, please come to the rally of Richard Lugar to be the chief Republican spokesman in the U.S. Senate in the future. And Mr. Hitchens, would you look into this and promote this idea? Because Jesse Helms cannot be the spokesman Republican for this country. I'd be ashamed for him to be the Republican Senate spokesman for foreign policy.
Thanks.
I think I'm entitled to take it as a comment. Look, things are not so bad that I'm going to have to decide who's the Republican spokesman on foreign affairs, but I should say that Madeleine Albright seemed to think that Jesse Helms was the spokesman not just for the Republican Party in the Senate, but for the Senate itself. So I don't think very much has changed on that score.
Lexington, Kentucky. Hello.
Good morning, Mr. Hitchens.
Good morning.
2 questions for you.
Mm-hmm.
First...
You're a long way from home.
Yes, I'm rather a long way from home. You're a controversial writer, by American standards anyway. You've written... Your book, No One Left to Lie To, seemed to take you off the screens, the talk shows, for quite a while.
Well, I'm back, okay.
Yes, I was very glad to see you back on Hardball, actually, but I wonder whether you could speak to the fact that this is, you know, the freedom of the press, okay? The freedom of the press over here is not... and perhaps they don't have the freedom that they think they have, okay? I know you did get slammed by a couple of newspapers in England for that book. I mean, you weren't, you know...
I think they have, well...
I think the Guardian wrote,
You said 2 questions. I'm just thinking, can you condense a bit? Because you said you had 2.
Yes, the second one was just, is Peter Hitchens related to you?
Peter's my younger brother.
Did you feel
There's
like
one Tory in every family. Well, actually, I don't know. Sometimes seems there's more than one Tory in every family when you go to Britain. He's written just an extremely good statement of the right-wing Tory case, I must say, in Britain, which Brian was talking to him about on Book Notes recently. But one person who will forgive me if I don't promote his book will be Peter, I think.
Do you feel...
I'm going to promote my own stuff.
Were you taken off of the shows because of your book?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I was about to say, if there are restrictions on the freedom of the press or the liberty of expression in this country, you couldn't prove it by me. I've been incredibly well treated, very generously treated in America. I don't have, I sometimes feel, enough unpublished thoughts. I could probably appear on radio or TV much more often than I do if I said yes every time, and the same with scribbling. So maybe I'm spoiled. But I try and make the most of it, and I think the answer to your question would be that there's no theoretical limit on how much can be said and contemplated and cogitated and published here at all. I just do think that not enough advantage is taken by those who have this amazing privilege of it. And very often, you know, people sit on things or downplay them or de-emphasize them. And very often they do this because they feel that, well, they have a responsibility to consensus or to healing or to unity and the other things with which I was being tempted earlier on, if you were watching.
In 22 minutes, where it will be 6 a.m. in Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, San Diego, Los Angeles, way out on the West Coast. We have somewhat East Coast-centric here.
Yes.
We will have Tony Blankley as our guest, but for the moment, Christopher Hitchens, we go to Los Angeles. You're next.
Hello.
Hi, you're on the air.
Yes, I've heard a theory about Mr. Kissinger that back in the 60s, I think it was, that Turkey was sort of blackmailing the United States. We were going to kick us out of their country. We couldn't renew our contracts with our air bases there and our listening posts into Russia. And so Kissinger and Nixon went to the Shah of Iran, made a deal with him to put in listening posts up in their northern part of their country. And anyway, the Shah said, well, I'd like to have a modern Air Force. And Nixon and Kissinger said, sure, okay, we'll sell you some. And then the Shah said, well, I don't have the wherewithal to purchase that. And then he, I don't know which side, suggested to start OPEC so they could increase the cost of the oil per barrel. It was like about $2 or $3 a barrel back then. And then 10 years later, it went up to $30 a barrel. And I was wondering if you'd like to comment on that, if you know anything about that. I'll hang up now.
Well, I would caution you from experience against any explanation that appears to explain too much, as yours does. I think that's resting too much mega development on a smaller one. Something of what you say is certainly true. There was a shift, a sort of insurance policy was taken out on the Pahlavi dynasty, the Shah's family, because of concern about stability in Turkey. Very exorbitant arms sales were made to Iran, and big kickbacks were given to the Nixon-Kissinger campaign by some of the people who profited from those arms sales, which were probably, many of them, extremely unwise, and certainly helped to develop the Pahlavi regime into a military dictatorship. It also helped to fuel what later became the Iran-Iraq War, in which an uncounted number of people perished pointlessly. And yes, it's true that Kissinger was always a defender of the Shah, always covered up for him, always defended him against the truthful allegations that he employed a large staff of full-time professional torturers, which he most certainly did, and drove most intelligentsia out of Iran. It certainly counts against Kissinger that he was so involved in all that, but that was so much a general policy of a large wing of the American establishment at the time, before it imploded in '79, that you can't really blame it all on him, in fairness. And as far as I know, it didn't break any international laws or violate any local ones either. So I have a glancing mention only of his skullduggery in that region, and of another aspect of it which you may remember, which was his betrayal of the Kurdish people. But I think we're straying a little now.
I need your quick take on, though, another story. The Philadelphia Inquirer's lead today is Mideast begins lengthy talks. Israelis and Palestinians are pessimistic about forging a peace treaty. And right below that is this story in the Baltimore Sun. Israelis turn to warrior Sharon. Eric Sharon, in all the articles, is being portrayed as the next prime minister of Israel. What impact will that have, and do you think it'll happen?
Well, to the second half of your question, it seems as if he's a sure thing to be elected, unless there's a switch in the Labour leadership at the last minute, which apparently Israeli electoral law allows. That's to say, Sharon beats Barak, apparently on doesn't matter how you measure it.
What if there's a deal?
But he wouldn't beat Perez.
What if there's a deal between now and then on this peace stuff?
Well, I don't think anyone's going to sign a deal till they know.
Who's the next
I'll tell you why, because Sharon has said he won't honour any deal Barak signs. The Likud has already said that. So the Palestinians know that. They're not going to sign either. That seems to me, and now we know what Mr. Clinton was really doing in the last few weeks when he was in office. He was negotiating his own pardon strategy instead of paying attention to these matters. It won't happen till the election's over. I think it would be a calamity if General Sharon became the Prime Minister of anywhere. Because I recently reread the Kahana Commission report, the Israeli government report on the massacres at Sabra and Shatila. It's a remarkably lenient document, by the way. It's much less critical and I think much less rigorous than it's often represented as being. But at the very minimum, the very least you can say about this guy is that he stood with his hands on his hips and his binoculars and his boots looking at a mound of human corpses, which he didn't find objectionable at all.
There is a long piece in this week's New Yorker about Ariel Sharon, and the author of the piece spent some time on his 1,000-acre farm or ranch, whatever they call it, in Israel. Maybe, I think he may be the biggest landowner, individual landowner in Israel. Defiance, Ohio, are you there?
Yes, sir, I am.
You're
Defiance, Ohio.
You're on with Christopher Hitchens.
How wonderful.
Yes, sir, Mr. Hitchenson.
Good morning.
You over at The Nation have a very subjective way of looking at things. You come along here and you attack Henry Kissinger, and if, by the way, he is guilty, he should be prosecuted. But yet I hear nothing from The Nation or anyone else on the left about David Bonnier and Richard Gephardt and Maxine Waters during the 1980s who went down and gave aid and comfort to Daniel Ortega and his ilk in direct violation of the Logan Act. Why is the discrepancy here?
Let me see. Where to begin with that? Well, first, it's Harper's Magazine that's very kindly agreed to publish my findings, my allegations and findings, my evidence about Kissinger. So make sure that yours for Harper's on the newsstand this month and next. Second, I don't think any charge was ever brought or even suggested against the congressman who went to visit Nicaragua. And I don't think a Logan Act charge would have held against them either, so that's the answer to that.
Still there, Defiance?
They were violating the State Department regulations. They had already passed regulations in the mid-1980s that they were to not go anywhere near or have anything to do with.
I'm sorry, that's false. I was there at the time myself. The State Department can't tell a congressman he or she can't visit a neighboring country. And you would not, I hope, coming as you do from Defiance, Ohio, approve of a State Department that even tried to arrogate that sort of power to itself. So I think you have it all wrong, as a matter of fact.
Caller, go ahead.
I said my brother was in the Vietnam War, yes, and he received 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star. But I'm just saying, if you're going to go after someone like Kissinger and show documents where he violated the law, you should also go after the other side. I mean, fair is fair here. What happened to this bipartisan stuff we were supposed to be hearing after the election?
Well, I think you've already heard my opinion about that.
Detroit, Michigan, you're next.
Yes, good morning. I'm glad to see you on C-SPAN. Mr. Hitchens, my 2 questions. Do you really think that the public's going to be up in arms over Kissinger when Ronald Reagan and Oliver North, when the Contra affair was such an atrocity and such a cover-up? The other thing, to answer your question about freedoms not being taken advantage of here in the States, and I think it comes down to apathy, and we take for granted everything that we have. Thank you.
Well, I'd be sorry to think that the last was true, and I think the evidence is that it's not. In fact, not meaning to flatter my host or the C-SPAN 3, congratulations, by the way. It seems to me that this network is evidence to the contrary. I didn't quite get the force of your first point, but it seemed to be similarly fatalistic. Again, I'm willing to try that on. My bet is that when people become aware of the fact that the standards that the United States claims to represent in the enforcement of human rights and international law generally are violated by this egregious case within its own borders, that something may be done to redress it, to do some justice to the victims, as well as to the perpetrator, and to clean up and update our historical record, our knowledge of our own recent past and the workings of our institutions. Now, you can't say any of that is boring or dry or uncontroversial or unlikely to kindle as an issue. I think it has every chance of kindling.
Way off topic, this little note in today's New York Post. Headline is, Hill bumped off Prez jet and given a coach pass. Vince Morris writes, Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton, who kissed goodbye the comforts of Air Force One when her husband relinquished his job over the weekend, will now be traveling like the rest of us on coach. Aides to Clinton, who marked yesterday as the first time in 8 years she awoke without her First Lady mantle, says she decided to travel between New York home and the nation's capital, probably on a shuttle and not by private jet. She hasn't decided if she's going to fly or take the train, her spokesman Howard Wolfson said yesterday. When she decides, we'll let you know.
I'm willing to wait.
Is it a big issue?
I can be patient about that.
Shreveport, you're on.
Hello.
Hi.
Yes. Big fan of C-SPAN and Christopher Hitchens. I'm a kind of a rare bird here. I'm a Southerner, and I'm very. Actually down here I'm moderate, but everybody thinks I'm a liberal. But I would love his opinion of what he thinks the Bush administration is going to do about labor laws, which I work for a non-union company, which is about all we have down here, and we're harassed constantly and treated like, you know what. I'm also worried about environmental laws and safety on the job. But I would love to. I'm going to hang up, and I want to hear his opinion.
Well, I think the state of affairs with labor law, especially the only bit that I know anything about or studied at all, and you're not coming to an expert, I'm afraid, namely the right to form a union or to try and campaign to form a union without facing the threat of dismissal or the fact of it, has needed urgent attention for some time. I read an extraordinary statistic recently, I don't have it to hand, but how many Americans last year were dismissed their jobs simply for advocating union membership, or advocating having a union shop. And it's usually not worth it for a union to contest these cases because there are so many of them and it takes so long to get a justice or reinstatement. So very often people decide, well, anyway, they'll go off and work somewhere else. This makes the United States very unusual among developed capitalist countries in making the onus so heavily on those who think that their job should be unionized and have union scale and protection.
I wanted to ask you about this.
But I don't think you can look, given how little attention the Clinton administration and the Clinton Labor Department paid to that, I don't suppose you can look for very much better luck from the incomers.
In this story about Colin Powell, it says, Robin Wright writes, but Secretary of State Colin Powell is about to launch a quiet revolution in American diplomacy by proposing to scrap many, maybe even most of the punitive sanctions imposed by the United States. The vast majority over the last decade, she writes. And then she says about 75 of the world's nearly 200 countries are currently subject to U.S. sanctions. Several have been sanctioned for multiple offenses ranging from mislabeling cans of tuna at one end of the scale to engaging in egregious human rights violations and narcotics trafficking at the other.
It's interesting. Does Robin Wright, I used to know her slightly, does she instance any particular countries? Those are cases rather than countries she's talking about.
Well, she goes into some about all the different, you know, like Iraq and
yes.
Countries like that. But she says that Powell's proposed reversal would be a boon to American business. USA Engage, a coalition of more than 670 U.S. companies committed to easing embargoes, estimates that sanctions cost the United States as much as $19 billion annually in lost exports and deprive the economy of more than 200,000 high-wage jobs. Almost half of the 125 unilateral economic sanctions imposed by the United States since World War I were initiated from 93 to 98, according to surveys by USA Engage.
That's interesting. It reminds me to say I was amazed. I didn't know that the general was on 52 corporate boards until his confirmation hearings.
But only one was for profit.
Only one for profit, but I was impressed that he said he would be recusing himself on a case-by-case basis as if, you know, the State Department will still be flipping through the Fortune 500 to see which bits the Secretary can deal with.
Davenport,
today,
Iowa.
It looks as if they have some business input into this sanctions decision.
Davenport, Iowa. You're on with Christopher Hitchens.
Hi, Christopher. I was wondering your thoughts on the Jonathan Pollard case. And from my understanding, Clinton was going to pardon him, but the CIA, head of the CIA, said he'd quit. And that's my question. Thanks.
I was reliably told that at the Y agreement, which is now, I think, 2 years ago, the meeting with then Prime Minister Netanyahu and Mr. Clinton, that Mr. Netanyahu said that he wanted to take Pollard back with him to Jerusalem on the plane, and Clinton agreed until George Tenet, head of the CIA, who I notice has been re-upped by President Bush, said he would walk if that happened. Yeah, I believe that to be true. I realized that Mr. Pollard wasn't going to get pardoned once the election was over, because the only time it was likely he'd be pardoned before that would be for the sake of Mrs. Clinton's campaign in New York, and when she no longer needed him, I felt sorry for the guy, because he's been in jail for an awfully long time and has always been tortured with the hope of a pardon.
So you think he should
I thought now they don't need him, so he's going to stay there.
You think he should be pardoned?
No, I don't say that he should be pardoned. I mean, I think what he did was obviously very grave. He does seem to have been in jail for a very long time.
Brooklyn, New York, for Christopher Hitchens. Go ahead, please.
Greetings. First off, the obligatory kudos to C-SPAN and yourself, Mr. Lamb. Mr. Hitchens, an admirer of your work, sir.
Thank you.
I had a question about, I suppose, if you perceive any distinct drift in the work of Edward Said and his particular views on the Middle East, and if you still feel that his thoughts on that matter are trenchant, or if perhaps, given that, at least from what I've read of your own work, that you seem to modify your opinion.
Thanks. Who is he, before you give the answer, please?
Edward Said holds the chair at the English department. That's the least you can say. He sort of dominates the English department, really, at Columbia University in New York. Is the author of innumerable works of criticism, literary criticism. And it could be said, I suppose, that the whole field of what's called post-colonial studies in English, in other words, the relationship between the language and the way that it became an imperial language, and then the language of people who were ex-subjects of the empire. That's a domain, a field that Edward dominates. And he's a Palestinian Christian Arab by birth, birth in Jerusalem. And he's been very much associated with the PLO. He was, in fact, a member of the Palestine National Council, which is one of its directing bodies, until he resigned from that in protest against the autocratic rule of Mr. Arafat, the undemocratic internal nature of the thing. And since the signing of the Oslo Accord, of which he's always been a very stern critic, he's evolved from what you might have very, very roughly described as a nationalist position, calling for a Palestinian state, a state that would be an equal, a state that would not be a vassal or Bantustan of Israel, but a proper homeland for the Palestinians, to the view that it might be better to go all the way back to the beginning, to where a lot of liberal Zionists and secular Arabs always were in the 30s and 40s, and consider having a state that didn't define its citizenship by nationality or by religion. You either were or were not a Palestinian, not that you were a Jewish Palestinian or an Arab or a Druze or a Bedouin Palestinian, that, as with the United States, you didn't hyphenate. And though I must say, well, you don't need me to point out there are utopian elements to that desire. I'm very glad that there are people like him on the Arab side who think that way and are brave enough to risk the disapproval of the Arab political establishment.
This story is politics, I know, and you're not talking about that, but I want your opinion if you would like to give it. Unemployed Andy revs up Gov bid. This is about Andrew Cuomo. And it says that Andrew Cuomo moved swiftly over the weekend to begin preparing his race for governor, approving the hiring of campaign staffers and setting up his fundraising in motion. He's going to make the decision in a couple of weeks. He's the son of Mario Cuomo. They say here that Denise Rich, who is here's a picture of her, the wife of Mark Rich, who was pardoned over the weekend by former President Clinton, will have a welcoming home party to be held next Monday at the Fifth Avenue home of the Rich family. And although Mr. Rich hadn't been in this country for 17 years because he's been a fugitive from justice, While the Rich event won't be a fundraiser, it is expected to attract financially powerful state and national Democratic Party figures. What do you think?
I think the Rich pardon stinks, I must say, and it symbolizes to me the way that Mr. Clinton, while he was in office, decided, mainly to socialize with the people who make money rather than the people who earn it in the society, and to make himself incredibly available to do them favors at all times, whether they were Americans or not. So I think that's sad. And then something in me dies a little when I think of another Cuomo campaign, even under another name, because not only is he another Cuomo, but if I'm not wrong, he's married to another Kennedy. So we have to go through all that again and be told about, the magic of Camelot. And I don't think, no. As I say, my heart sinks at the thought of it.
Last call for Christopher Hitchens, Naperville, Illinois. Good morning.
Good morning, C-SPAN. Mr. Hitchens here. I have make a couple of quick comments. I don't believe that the left fully understands how that kind of a society won't work. Look at California right now. I understand that we would like justice for people and stuff like that, but I just don't see how that would work. And as far as the Vietnam War and what you talk about Kissinger and that, we're too close right now to evaluate the significance of what was done there, okay? The idea that this whole thing it's a dynamic world and the whole thing is interrelated. Now, we won the Cold War, okay? Whether we would have or not in Indochina is another matter. It's up to history to debate. The same with the Contras. We had this thing in Latin America with Noriega and that. If communism would have won, would that have been a better outcome than what we have now?
Thanks, caller.
Well, very simple question to answer in the case of Indochina. The insurgent forces did win, in spite of this terrible and wasteful and destructive war in any case. As in my judgment, it was very likely they were going to do, because they had inherited from the struggle against the French occupation of Indochina the mantle of nationalism. And if you notice, the surviving regimes that still call themselves communist and that are still in power and have survived the collapse of communism as a system are basically there because they were part of that post-war anti-colonial nationalist wave, and for no other real ideological reason, and don't profess any ideology. Besides that, to say that it's too soon to say about Vietnam, I mean, I like your mind in a way, and as you know, it's a very old joke about the Chinese diplomat asked to comment on the French Revolution, saying, well, it's a bit early to tell. But I think it's not too early to say that we can make judgments about who was lied to in that war. That's the American people. What was damaged, the American Constitution. Who was murdered, millions of Vietnamese, and who was responsible, Henry Kissinger.
Sorry, we're out of time. Part one of the two-part series in Harper's Magazine, the February edition, has The Case Against Henry Kissinger, The Making of a War Criminal, by our guest, Christopher Hitchens. We thank you very much.
Always a pleasure.
And in just a moment, after we show you this story, that Joel Heffley, a Republican congressman from Colorado, this winter will become the 435th member of Congress to finally get on the internet. Tony Blankley in just a minute.